Do it.
Oh. You just like put on a smile right away.
Yeah.
Wait, we're filming.
I was gonna ask.
Welcome to the last, or
No, it's next to last.
Okay, excuse me. The
Who's
next to
tracking?
last mentorship program video.
Wherein we're actually doing what I'd like to call a panel. This is a mentor panel with hats.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a specific context we're going to start with, kind of a question. So I'll take a minute to set some context, and then we'll just see where it goes from there. So the question that I'd like to ask for us to explore, and I don't think there's actually one answer, is how do you spend your development budget? And what I mean by development budget is that we have a limited or a fixed resource with time, like we only live for so long, and we have a limited amount of other resources, and we have up against that, or the other side of that is we have kind of an unlimited amount of choices to make around how we're going to develop ourselves as human beings. And so how do you make those work together in a way that works? That's kind of what's on the floor. Mm-hmm. And I'll start the first, and I think what had me think of this was this contrast between something called The Outliers. It's a Malcolm Gladwell book where he talks about research that had been done where if you really want to get really, really masterful at something, it takes about 10,000 hours of practice to get to be at like world mastery level at something. Which is something like, 5 or 6 years at a full-time job. It's a lot of hours. Mm-hmm. And then I was contrasting that with, there was a TED Talk I watched, and I think the guy's name was Josh Kaufman, where he basically did another kind of research and determined that it takes about 20 hours to get just okay at something. Like if you have no skill at whatever it is you're trying to learn, if you put about 20 hours of focused attention on it, you can get to be okay. And so, there's just lots of different frames for how you might choose to slice up how you're going to use your human potential. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to know how everybody has decided to do that and their thoughts on this topic.
I'd heard something similar to that 20 hours, but the way I'd heard it was not necessarily 20 hours, but it was described as like an 80-20 rule, where to get 80% of the way there, it'd only take you 20% of the time to like reach mastery, but to like reach that last 20% of mastery, it would take you 80% of the time, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's a real question of preference. Like maybe you want to be pretty good at a lot of things. Or maybe, because of your disposition, you want to be really good at just one thing. You just really want to, like, burrow and drill deep down into that. And so, that's, a choice that you have to make.
So I see it as like you're talking about what's sort of a diminishing return that you put in. The more time you put in, the less vertical height in your ability if you're doing it on like a graph you get. But you also get into this place where even fewer and fewer people have reached that level of skill.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of our, I was reading a little bit in a Peter Thiel book recently about startups and how they work, and the fact that our education these days is very much geared towards gaining a little bit of mastery in a broad variety of skills, like having a bunch of extracurriculars, a bunch of knowledge in different areas, which is good because then you as an individual know how to do many things, but actually in community and in making something amazing, I think it actually helps to have a significant degree of mastery in at least one area. Mm-hmm. And then you have people that have different degrees of mastery in different areas, so you can call on them. Like, for instance, Chad has, fantastic programming skills. Right? Is it programming?
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've reached mastery at that.
Yeah, and so I can call on him, and people can call on me for facilitation and such like that. So I actually think that even if it takes, there's a law of diminishing returns, getting to that level of mastery gives you a significant advantage over people who might not have that same level. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the topic that we're talking about, how you spend your time can actually be geared, I gear that in two ways. One is thinking about long-term planning. What skills do I want to have? What do I want mastery in? Which to me has been something between circling and general facilitation and basic business management, which is broader, spreading myself over a whole bunch of different areas and gaining enough knowledge in it, that I might do tasks that eventually I want to pass on to somebody, but I want knowledge in it for myself because in the long term I could see that being useful. And in the short term, noticing like what projects seem to have the lowest barrier to entry, basically, like what things are kind of already happening or have a lot of momentum or energy behind them, and then I can just kind of come in and push it forward. If it's something where I have to create all the infrastructure from scratch, it better have a damn good reason for me to be doing it.
So there's another dynamic that I'm curious about too. I really enjoyed that exploration. And another dynamic or frame I've put around this is this idea of spending time like accenting your strengths, or really the things that you're naturally good at, or spending that same time shoring up your weaknesses, the things that actually kind of knock you out. And I'm curious if people have thoughts on that.
For me, there's a big about how much is the weakness holding me back. If it's a sort of benign weakness, like arithmetic for me, like just like working numbers quickly, I'm like, I'll just use a calculator, and I don't feel a need to work on that in my life right now. There's not any reason that I can see so if there's a weakness that I notice is coming up for me as like a stopping point or holding me back, then that's definitely something for me to work on. And I know that there's such a tendency to follow the path of least resistance in me and other people that I know. So I'm trying to keep an eye on that when it comes to going with my strengths of like, what are these just muscles that are working all the time versus these smaller things, these weaknesses where I'll have a much better holistic ability to do things if I focus on the weaknesses.
So it sounds like you're saying if it's an area that's actually knocking you out in some of your areas where you're strong, if it's actually creating in that kind of impact.
Yeah, and sometimes
sometimes
that can be subtle of like noticing that, there's this thing that keeps coming up, and that can often comes up in relationship, or just community, or just other people noticing things. So it can take a while to notice them if they're subtle and not things that I think about much.
Yeah, with me, actually, my employer does a lot of research into doing strength-based development versus kind of development-based improvement. And it turns out that people that really focus on their strengths do well, but do better in the long term than focusing on where you're weak, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't. It just means that you need to strike that balance in a way that makes sense. And for me, I found that personally to be the case because I come up against a lot of difficulty in addressing places where I don't feel as strong, which I think of as weaknesses. And it can be kind of a downer. You kind of lose energy when you focus on that a lot. And I find what has really helped is just doing something I'm good at. Maybe it's just hobby I like doing some yoga or something. And it just improves my mindset and enables me to be more mentally healthy, just, improving that mental hygiene in dealing with the work of improving oneself. And if you just focus on what you're bad at all the time, it can just drain you, Yeah.
Right.
I think the way...
I was gonna touch on, I think that connects really well to what you were saying about community, because it not only allows the community to run in a way that's efficient. There's people have their own areas of expertise, and which means you're getting across the board a lot higher, more numbers of people who are experts at stuff. But it also gives the opportunity for people to feel really appreciated. Like, I'm the person in the community, or us, this small group of us are the ones that know how to do this, and so that sense of feeling special, I think, is also accented.
Yeah, quick story example. I was painting my room this weekend, and I managed to get paint all over the floor. And, I don't know anything about getting paint off the floor, and so I'm flipping out. And then these guys show up to make the video and, pull out a smartphone and look up how to get paint off the floor. But my brain just, doesn't go there. It's I get very single-minded, which is a huge strength. It means that I can work on projects for hours at a time, even if they take, a high degree of intellectualization. But it also means that I can't shift tracks very quickly. And so I just was I would have been scrubbing at the floor on hands and knees for all day with something that probably would have taken the polish off of it. But because that's a kind of silly one, but my strength isn't in shifting modes, and having other people come in and be able to do that was really good.
So there's I'm hearing two modes for dealing with your weaknesses. One is you can actually have coverage in community if that's workable. And then it sounds like from what you're saying is if there's something that's actually knocking out a strength, you may actually want to address that need not in community but more just within yourself. that seem to fit?
Yeah.
Or it might be with community support or working things out through circling or relational practice, but just if I notice that I'm butting up against something, I have this tendency or avoidance or whatever it is that's holding me back.
Yeah.
One more thing on that is like I find it helpful to notice that like I'm a being in time and that things are going to shift for me if it keeps coming up, and that like I might not even notice some of the advances that I'm making during time. So a lot of the time I'll notice something that seems like a weakness in me and I'll just notice it. I'll be like, oh, that's there. And I'll put it in my mind and I'll know it about myself or have an idea of it about myself, and just like when it comes up again, rather than shaming myself for it, I'll just notice it, kind of like in meditation. And I think that helps keep it in mind that it's something that I'd like to shift and that I have patience around it. And my goal in all of it is just as much as possible to keep myself from judging myself for my weaknesses, because that's, I think, the worst possible thing that I could do around them.
Yep. I do like this topic. I find it very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Just a quick poll, actually. How many of you guys feel like you have? Would you consider yourselves like jack of all trades? Is that more of your style, or are you more like, no, I really want to get really amazing at something, or is it some combination between? Like, how is that for each of you?
I'm definitely more jack of all trades.
Yeah,
and I like synthesizing multiple things that I've learned.
Yep, and that's exactly how I am too.
I think I'm somewhere in between. Like, I think I used to be more jack of all trades, and then started finding it more valuable to specialize.
I'm jack of all trades for sure, and feeling somewhat conflicted about that sometimes. But
I do too, actually.
Yeah.
Like, I'd like to have one thing that I was like one of the top X number of people in the world that I was good at. Like that would be great, and I do want to make that shift in my own development.
Yeah, that's something that was highlighted for me in the last year with my boyfriend, is very much, this is the one thing that I'm doing and I'm going to be one of the best people in the world at this. And he very deliberate about how he spends his time, because he's like, okay, that's a distraction from this one thing. And through that's influenced me a little about having more discernment, where there's part of me that's like, I really want to take an auto mechanics class. And I want to learn woodworking, and I like those are so interesting. And
I've taken those classes.
Yeah, there we go.
So, or like just auditing random classes at the university, and I'm like, oh, maybe I should wait and not do that. Maybe at some point that can. So there's the balance of like hobby and fun and play, and also like, all right, Heather, focus on.
If you,
I love that consideration. You know, like that to me is like that the piece I was wanting to bring out in very alive. Like, I have a consideration. Am I going to spend my time jack of all trading, or am I going to really master something?
And to bring up the 80-20 rule again, that also applies to the fact that like 20% of the things we do produce 80% of the results. So it's like, if you're spending equal amounts of time on being the person to like paint your house or fix your car or build your bench or whatever, as you are on the other things, that's probably actually not highest efficiency. Like, you could be using that time to like make the money to hire somebody to do that. So I find it useful to think about when, like, where my priorities actually are and where my shadows are around that. Like, for instance, it's really difficult for me a lot of the time to justify spending money, but sometimes doing that actually frees me up space to do other things that feel important.
Right. Excellent.
Rather than spending 20 hours trying to learn the skill that I could have hired somebody to do.
I feel fairly complete, and I feel really glad that we did this, and mostly just wanted to film this for you guys to introduce the question and have you, hopefully it will be useful to you to consider, like, how am I spending my time around my development? Do I want to make a shift? Do I want to lean more towards master, or maybe I'm only focusing on one thing and I'd like to spread out a little bit? Is there a weakness that's actually knocking me out? Or am I only focusing on my weaknesses and I'm not actually taking the time to delve more into developing my strengths? Kind of those kinds of questions. I think they're really, there's no right answer, but I think it's a great question to ask. Kind of an ongoing question is how I see it,
Yeah.
And were we going to address financial development budget as well?
You go for it.
About how, because that's obviously another resource, is how we spend money on workshops and courses, and when I first started doing authentic relating and circling things, I was pissed off at how expensive things can be. And like, I guess for me, I had sort of an ethical thing if it was like charging for church, but but also people need to eat and make a living. And so for me personally, there's such different personalities around finances and people's available income or disposable income for self-development, whatever. And so for me, there's what can I develop on my own. It's a more of a bootstrapping approach. Like, what can I do on my own in community versus, or what, either on my own and or in community, versus a workshop. And then of the workshops, what's just like, that sounds nice and like it would be feel good, but like what hits the nail on the head the most with what I need to do. And an analogy for that is like I do a lot of swing dancing, Lindy Hop, and blues. And I was taking classes for a long time. Then I realized I could keep taking advanced classes or get one-on-one lessons, but really just going to social dances and dancing a lot and taking other forms of dance classes so I can work in other things into my physical vocabulary when I dance. Like, that led to more development in my dancing than spending all the money on private lessons or whatever.
That's cool.
I guess the main thought that's come for me around around using my financial stuff for personal development is this idea that I think I had a somewhat similar view to you, some flavor of that, like not wanting to spend lots of money on it. And it was probably within the last year I watched a video of a guy named Ty Lopez, and he was just talking about how, like, spend money on developing yourself. Like, it's like this resource you're going to carry with you for the rest of your life. I mean, a car deteriorates. You know, a house may or may not go up and down in value, but when you invest in your own development, you have that resource for the rest of your life. And so that really shifted my perspective on my willingness to put my money into me, basically. You know.
There's actually also been some research lately showing that spending money on experiences actually makes more happiness than spending money on things, because experiences are things that you can like relate, like you have with other people, and then share that as something to strengthen your connections, and they're things that you're going to remember for longer and see as novel and bring up as novel more often than an object.
I like hearing that.
Yeah, I like the idea that Chad brought up about investing in yourself, and in the world of business, you think about like the return on your investment, right? And there's certainly data about types of people that maybe you can even think about it as earning more. There's certain types of people that might even like draw more wealth, and if you invested in developing those characteristics, you really do think about it as a return on investment.
Yeah, that's earlier I was thinking about workshops and like, oh, do I take this series of classes, etc. But as y'all were speaking, I remembered that after college, I spent 15 months traveling, and I initially was like, oh, well, I should wait till I'm older and I have more money saved. And I was like, how long is that going to take? Plus, like, there's so many convoluting things that can get in the way. And the return on investment as a human being that I'll get is it's so much better to me to like get that in my early mid-20s than to wait until like 10, 20 years later. So, and that'll impact all my relationships and success and just who I am and happiness and everything.
Do we feel complete?
Yeah.
Yep.
Excellent.
Thanks for joining us.
I had a fun story actually to close with. It's a mastery story. No, it's actually kind of entertaining. I hope I don't. I mean, I'm probably going to foul it up a little bit, but I'm going to take a crack at it. See if I can pull it off. So it's just a story. It's a funny story about mastery and how it can show up in the world. There's a big like a cruise ship, and their engine wasn't working. I think it was like an old-timey steamship, and this was costing them lots and lots of money. And they hired a guy, an expert, in whatever the particular engine was. So the guy comes down and he looks it over. He kind of thinks for a minute, and he reaches into his little tool bag that he brought, and he pulls out a hammer, and he like goes over to this one spot and he taps it 3 times, and then all of a sudden like the engine starts working again. And he turns to the guy who hired him and he said, "That'll be $5,000, please." And the guy's like, "What? You walked in and you tapped the thing with a hammer 3 times? Like, what do you mean $5,000? And he says, "Well, I can write you an invoice if you want." And he's like, "Yeah, hell yeah." And so he pulls out a piece of paper and he writes down, "For tapping with hammer, 50 cents. for knowing where to tap $4,999.50. So there, I just love that story because it does illustrate that when you get to those higher levels of mastery, there's something really precious waiting for you. Okay, bye.
Yay!
Hats off to you.
Out.